Hey there, deep divers. Today we're diving into game theory, and it's going to be especially interesting for you, our philosopher friend, listening in. You gave us this whole stack of articles and excerpts, mostly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on game theory.
Yeah.
And it just got me thinking, like, how can this field, which seems to be all about, like, numbers and strategies and stuff,
Right.
actually help us understand these big philosophical questions about rationality, about
Mm.
cooperation, even the evolution of language?
It really is a fascinating kind of crossover, isn't it? You've got game theory with its roots in economics,
Right.
giving us this really unique lens to look at human behavior, social dynamics, which of course are things that philosophers have been, grappling with for centuries.
Yeah, and I was really struck by this example from Plato about the Battle of Delium.
Okay.
It just illustrates how a soldier's choice,
Right.
in the heat of battle, a choice that seems totally rational, actually could lead to,
Uh.
like, a disastrous outcome for the whole army.
Oh, it's a classic example, isn't it? It really shows how individual rationality
Mhm.
can sometimes clash with what's good for the whole group, the collective well-being.
Yeah,
Plato talks about the soldier thinking, well, if we're going to win this battle, my individual contribution won't really make much of a difference.
right.
And if we're going to lose,
I
well,
better get out of
I
here.
better run away. And just from a pure self-interest point of view,
Yeah,
it seems perfectly logical. But of
totally.
course, the problem is if everyone thinks this way,
The whole army is just going to,
the army just collapses before they even engage the
and
enemy.
before they even start.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what rationality even means in that kind of situation.
Yeah, it really
And
does.
this isn't just some, ancient history lesson.
No.
We see this kind of thinking play out, like, throughout military history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, what about when Cortez burned his ships when he got to Mexico?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, on the surface, it seems reckless, crazy, even long,
Mm-hmm.
but you look at it through the lens of game theory and it's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's strategic.
Yeah, by taking away that option of retreat,
Right.
Cortez was basically forcing his soldiers to be absolutely committed to the fight.
Yeah, he's like, we're either winning this or we're all going down.
Yeah.
Plus, think about the message that's said to the Aztecs.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
It's psychological warfare.
totally, yeah. It's like he's saying, I'm so sure we're going to win that I'm willing to burn my own escape route.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about Henry V at Agincourt? He slaughtered his French prisoners.
Yeah, brutal act, for sure. But
Yeah.
again, you can see the strategic thinking there. By eliminating the possibility of surrender, for his own troops,
Right.
he basically made them fight harder.
They had no choice.
Yeah, they had to fight for their life, right? And these examples just show how a leader, or anyone really, can change the incentives
Hmm.
to get people to act in a certain way.
To get the outcome they want.
Yeah, to get the outcome they want. And it's not just on the battlefield, right? This applies to all sorts of things.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, historically, how militaries have dealt with desertion.
Right.
Make it economically irrational to desert.
Exactly. Yeah. Historically, the threat of execution has
Right.
been a very powerful deterrent, right? It makes staying and fighting, however risky,
Yeah.
the more rational choice, at least if you're thinking about self-preservation.
Yeah, you want to survive.
Yeah.
It really highlights how strategic decision-making, it's not just about
Yeah.
evaluating your choices in isolation.
It's about so much more than that.
You have to understand how your actions are going to influence the actions of other people
Exactly.
and how their actions are going to influence yours.
Right. It's like a giant chess game, with all these interconnected moves.
Yeah.
Every move you make has these ripple effects, and the key is to anticipate those effects.
To be a few steps ahead.
Yeah. That's what makes for a successful strategy.
Okay, well, speaking of games,
Yeah.
one of the excerpts you shared introduces this game called the river crossing game.
Right.
And it really piqued my interest.
The river crossing game. Yeah, it's a classic scenario for showing all the different kinds of problems a decision maker might face.
Okay.
So we have this fugitive, right? He needs to cross a river, and he has three choices of bridges.
Okay.
One bridge is totally safe.
Okay.
One has the risk of falling rocks.
Oh, fun.
And the last one, well, it's infested with cobras.
Okay, so not great choices.
No, not great choices, but initially this looks like what we call a parametric problem.
Parametric. So what does that mean?
It means the environment itself, the rocks, the cobras,
Right.
they're the main challenge.
Okay.
It's like one of those choose-your-own-adventure books,
I love those.
but with, really dangerous options.
Yeah, high stakes.
Yeah, high stakes, exactly.
Okay, so that's parametric.
Right, but here's where things get really interesting, right? It becomes a strategic problem when you add a pursuer into the mix.
Okay.
So now our fugitive, he's not just thinking about the dangers of each bridge.
Yeah.
He also has to think about what the pursuer is likely to do.
Oh, so it becomes a game of wits.
Exactly. It's not just about surviving the environment.
Right.
It's about outsmelting your opponent.
Okay, to analyze that kind of strategic thinking,
Yeah.
we need to bring in this idea of utility functions.
Yes.
I mean, could you explain those, especially for, our philosopher friend who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. A utility function is basically a way of assigning numbers to someone's preferences, right? It's a way for us to model how much they value different outcomes.
Okay,
And it's important to remember that at first we're often working with ordinal utility functions,
okay.
which means we're focused on the ranking of those preferences, not the actual size of the numbers.
So, like, if our fugitive, he values crossing safely more than risking the rocks and risking
Yeah.
the rocks more than facing the cobras, we might assign numbers like 3, 2, and 1.
Ex-
But the important thing is the order, right? Not the actual numbers.
The order, that's the key.
Not that he hates cobras 3 times as much as falling rocks or something.
Yeah, it's not about measuring like happiness on some universal scale,
Yeah.
right? It's about figuring out what's more important to that individual.
Yeah, how they rank things.
Yeah, and even small differences in those preferences can lead to very different choices and outcomes.
It makes me think about how we even define rationality in this kind of situation.
Yeah.
Especially for, a philosopher who's probably thinking about rationality in a much broader sense.
Right, right.
So how does game theory define rationality? And how does that match up with, or maybe even clash with,
Yeah.
these philosophical ideas of rationality?
It's a really important question. And you're right, the word rationality can be tricky.
Loaded.
Loaded, yeah, it's got all this baggage, especially in philosophy.
Right.
In game theory, we use it in a much more specific way, more technical.
Mm.
We often call it economic rationality.
Yeah.
And it really depends on a certain set of constraints that we put on preferences.
So it's not necessarily about making choices that, from the outside seem logical or even morally good.
Right.
It's about being consistent with your own preferences,
Yes, exactly.
even if those preferences seem kind of weird.
Yeah, or even self-defeating, right?
Right.
Someone can be perfectly rational in game theory terms and still make choices that other people would think are irrational, even immoral.
Right. It's about what makes sense to them.
Exactly. Given what they want to achieve and the rules of the game, those choices make perfect sense from their perspective.
Right.
That difference between, individual rationality and what's considered ethical,
Yeah.
that's a key point for our philosopher friend to think about.
Yeah. It makes me think about, like, the tension between what's rational for an individual
Yeah.
versus what's best for the whole group.
Absolutely. We see that tension all the time, right? In all sorts of social dilemmas. And that's where the tools of game theory can be really helpful.
Right.
It lets us move beyond just our gut feelings
Yeah.
and really analyze what's going on strategically.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get into, like, specific dilemmas,
Yeah.
we need a way to represent these games visually, right? Like, how can we show the potential outcomes in a clear way?
Right.
What are the tools for that?
Well, there are two main approaches, right?
Okay.
We've got game trees and we've got matrices.
Okay. Let's start with matrices.
Okay.
Since we've been talking about this river crossing game,
Right.
could we represent that scenario using a matrix?
Absolutely. Each row could represent like the fugitive's choices of bridges,
Okay.
and each column, would represent the pursuer's choices.
Okay.
And then the cells in the matrix would show, what happens, the outcomes
Okay.
for each combination of choices.
So it's like a strategic blueprint.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, before we try to fill in that matrix
Yeah.
and get into all the, the nitty-gritty,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about this classic example called the prisoner's dilemma.
Right.
It keeps popping up in the readings.
Yeah, the prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
It's a classic, right? It really shows how individual rationality and collective well-being
Yeah.
can sometimes be at odds.
Okay.
So we have these two suspects, right? They've been caught for a minor crime,
Right.
and they're being interrogated separately.
Separately. Okay.
Yeah.
So they can't talk to each other?
Exactly.
Okay.
And each suspect has a choice: confess and, rat out the other guy,
Okay.
or stay silent.
But what happens to them depends on what the other guy does.
That's right. Yeah. If they both stay silent,
Okay.
they both get a pretty light sentence. If they
Oh.
both confess, they both get a moderate sentence.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. If one confesses and the other stays silent,
Uh-oh.
the one who confesses goes free, while the silent one gets a much heavier sentence.
Oh, wow. So it's like a real incentive to betray the other guy.
Exactly. It creates this printy situation where each suspect, thinking only about themselves,
Yeah.
has a strong reason to confess, no matter what the other suspect does.
So even if he thinks the other guy's going to stay silent,
Yeah, even then.
It still makes sense for him to confess.
Yeah, that's the dilemma. In
Right.
game theory terms, we say that confessing is the strictly dominant strategy for each person.
Okay, strictly dominant strategy, I'm not sure I follow.
Oh, yeah. It just means that it's the strategy that gives you a better payoff,
Okay,
no matter what your opponent does.
okay,
So, in the prisoner's dilemma, confessing always leads to a better outcome for you individually,
okay.
whether the other guy confesses or stays silent.
But it's kind of paradoxical, right? Because if they both stayed silent,
Right.
they'd both be better off.
Exactly.
Why do they both end up confessing?
Well, because they're both acting rationally, but only for themselves.
Yeah,
It's counterintuitive, but the rational choice for each person
yeah.
leads to a worse outcome for both of them together.
So even with, like, perfect rationality, they both end up in a bad situation?
Exactly. This solution where they both confess,
Mm-hmm.
that's what we call a Nash equilibrium.
Nash equilibrium. Okay, I've heard of that, but
Yeah.
could you, like, remind me and maybe explain it for our listener?
Sure. A Nash equilibrium is just a situation where no player can improve their own outcome
Okay.
by changing their strategy alone, given what the other player is doing.
But they're both stuck,
Yeah, they're stuck.
even though there's a better outcome out there.
Exactly. They're stuck in this stable but frustrating situation.
So the structure of the game itself
Yeah,
is kind of preventing them from reaching the better outcome.
that's exactly right. It's a really interesting insight.
It is unsettling, though.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our exploration of all this stuff.
Oh, yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, it really exposes this tension that runs through, well, I guess through a lot of game theory and
Yeah.
philosophy too, right? This idea that what's rational for one person might not be the best thing for everyone.
Right, and that a stable outcome
Yeah.
might not be the best outcome.
Exactly.
That feels like it has, like, huge implications, not just for, economics, but also for, like,
Oh, yeah.
how we think about society, about ethical choices.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, right? If there's a better outcome possible,
Yeah.
why not just go for it? Why get stuck in this, not so great equilibrium?
Well, you said it yourself, like, the structure of the game itself
Right.
seems like a big constraint.
Yeah,
But for our philosopher friend listening, I'm curious, like,
yeah.
how does this idea of strategic decision-making
hmm
and these, like, potentially bad outcomes, how does that fit with, like, different ethical frameworks?
Right.
Can you be rational and still be, like, morally good?
That's the big question, isn't it? Philosophers have been wrestling with that one for centuries.
Yeah.
And game theory, I think, adds this whole new layer to the debate.
Okay.
The classic way we think about game theory, with its focus on individual rationality,
Yeah.
might seem to clash with some ethical systems,
Right.
especially the ones that emphasize, doing what's good for everyone.
Right. Like Kanti ethics, for example, with
Yeah.
the categorical imperative,
Yeah,
acting according to rules that you could universalize.
right, right.
It seems like in the prisoner's dilemma, if everyone always confessed,
Yeah.
it would be bad news for everyone.
It would be a disaster, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it shows the limits of just applying this individualistic rationality to these
Uh-huh.
bigger social and moral questions.
Okay.
But I don't think this means game theory is wrong.
Right.
I see it more as a tool to help us understand the challenges of applying different ethical frameworks
Okay.
in these strategic situations.
So it's like game theory is this stress test
Yeah, I like
for our
this.
ethical intuition.
It is.
Like it makes us really confront these conflicts
Yeah,
between self-interest and the common good.
exactly. And by understanding those conflicts,
Yeah.
we can start thinking about how to design systems that actually encourage people to cooperate,
Right.
even when their individual incentives might push them in the wrong direction.
Okay, so like real world example,
Yeah,
climate change.
yeah,
One person's actions might not seem like much,
right.
but altogether,
Yeah.
they have these huge consequences.
Exactly. So how can we use game theory to deal with these big social dilemmas?
Yeah, that's the question.
It is a big one, and there's a whole area of game theory that's really relevant here, the study of repeated games.
Repeated games.
Yeah, so in these games, it's not just one interaction, it's a series of interactions over time.
So you have to think about, like,
Yeah.
not just the immediate payoff,
Right.
but, like, the consequences down the line.
Exactly. It's like you're building a reputation, right? If you cooperate today, it
Yeah.
might encourage others to cooperate with you in the future.
But if you cheat,
Yeah, if you betray trust.
yeah, you mess up your reputation.
Exactly. You make it harder to cooperate later on.
So there's this balance between, like,
Yeah.
short-term self-interest and long-term cooperation.
Exactly. And it turns out that even in games like The Prisoner's Dilemma, where it seems like you should always betray the other guy,
Right.
if you play it over and over again,
Yeah.
cooperation can actually emerge.
It's like that Churchill quote.
Yeah.
You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing
Yeah.
after they've tried everything else.
Ray loved that.
It's like with repeated interactions,
Yeah.
you have a chance to learn from your mistakes
Exactly. You get to adapt.
and maybe find a better way.
And figure out how to cooperate.
Okay, so how do we actually model these repeated games?
Well, one important idea is future punishment.
Future punishment.
Right. If you know your actions today are going to affect how other people treat you tomorrow,
Yeah.
it gives you a reason to cooperate.
Right.
Even if you might be tempted to cheat in the short term.
So it's like a built-in accountability system.
Exactly. Yeah, but you might be thinking, do people really have to, like, calculate all these costs and benefits?
Right. Who has time for that?
Yeah, all the time. It seems exhausting.
Yeah.
And that's one of the interesting things about game theory.
Okay.
The models might assume everyone's hyper-rational, like these calculating machines.
Yeah.
But real people, they often use simpler rules of thumb
Right.
that approximate those calculations.
So it's not always like conscious strategizing.
No.
It's more like following intuitions.
Exactly. Intuitions that have worked in the past.
Okay. And is there an example of like one of those simple strategies?
Yeah, one famous one is called tit for tat.
Tick for tat. What is that?
It's really simple. You cooperate on the first move,
Okay.
and then you just do whatever your opponent did on the previous move.
Okay. So if they cooperate, you cooperate.
Yeah.
If they cheat, you cheat.
Exactly, an eye for an eye.
Okay. But does that actually work?
It's surprisingly effective.
Really?
Yeah, in simulations and experiments, tit for tat consistently does a great job of promoting cooperation.
But the real world isn't always as simple as like a prisoner's dilemma, right?
Right, real life is messy.
It is.
The payoffs aren't always clear, and people, well, they don't always act rationally.
Right.
But that's where game theory is actually really powerful. It
Right.
gives us this framework for thinking about those messy situations,
Yeah.
for figuring out what the key strategic forces are
Okay.
and how they might shape people's choices.
So it's less about finding like one right answer
Yeah,
and more about having these tools to think critically about strategic interaction.
exactly.
Okay.
And that leads to another interesting application of game theory,
Okay.
understanding how norms and conventions develop in society.
Norms and conventions.
Yeah, like those unspoken rules.
Right. The rules everyone just seems to know.
Exactly.
What do those have to do with game theory?
Well, think about something like driving. We all agree to drive on the right side of the road.
Right. Or the left, depending on where you are.
Right, there's no reason one side is inherently better.
Yeah.
But we all have to coordinate.
Otherwise, it would be.
Chaos. Right, complete chaos.
Okay, so game theory helps us understand how those conventions develop,
Yeah, how they emerge and become stable.
even without someone like writing them down as laws.
Exactly. It's like a self-organizing system where
Right.
individual choices and interactions over time
Yeah.
lead to these shared expectations.
Okay, so those shared expectations,
Yeah.
the norms and conventions, they actually influence our behavior.
They really do, even if we're not aware of it.
Right,
They shape how we interact, they create incentives for cooperation,
right.
and they help society function.
It's amazing how something as like abstract as game theory
Yeah, I know, right?
can tell us so much about the real world.
It really is.
But we've been talking a lot about individual rationality.
Yeah.
What about those times when it seems like cooperating is the rational thing to do,
Yeah.
even in a one-shot game?
Mm-hmm.
Like where there's no expectation of future interaction.
Right.
Can't people just like see that working together is better for everyone?
You've hit on a really important point.
Okay.
And it leads to this idea of team reasoning.
Team reasoning.
Yeah, it suggests that people don't always approach these situations
Right.
from a purely individualistic perspective.
So instead of asking what's best for me,
yeah,
they're asking what's best for us.
exactly. And that shift in thinking
Right.
can lead to very different outcomes.
Okay.
Even in classic dilemmas like the prisoner's dilemma.
So if they're both reasoning as a team,
Yeah,
they're more likely to cooperate
much more likely.
and everyone wins.
Exactly. It's like realizing that we're all in the same boat.
Right.
Sinking, it doesn't help anyone.
But there's a catch, right?
There is.
Like how do you make sure everyone's on the same team?
Right, for team reasoning to work. You need everyone to understand what the team is
Yeah.
and what its goals are.
Yeah.
You need what we call focal points to coordinate their actions.
Focal points. Okay, what are those?
Think of them as like shared cues or signals
Oh.
that help people coordinate.
So like in driving, the lines on the road.
Exactly, the lines, the signs,
Yeah.
they make it clear which side to drive on.
Okay.
And in other social situations, focal points could be like cultural norms,
Oh.
shared values, or even just a common understanding of what's going on.
So you need both the motivation to cooperate
Yeah.
And a shared understanding of how to do it.
Exactly. It's like a dance.
I like that.
You need a partner who's willing to dance
Yes.
and who knows the steps.
Okay, so far this has all been pretty theoretical.
Yeah.
Does any of this stuff actually happen in real life?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Do people really behave the way game theory predicts?
I mean, we've been talking about these elegant models,
Yeah.
thought experiments.
Right.
But how does it all connect to, like, actual human behavior?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
One of the exciting things that's happened in recent years
Yeah.
is this rise of behavioral economics.
Behavioral economics.
Yeah, it combines psychology and economics
Okay.
to give us a more realistic picture of how people make decisions.
So it's acknowledging that people aren't always perfectly rational.
Right, we've got emotions, biases.
Yeah, all sorts of quirks.
All sorts of quirks.
That influence our choices.
Exactly. And game theory, it provides a framework, but
Yeah.
behavioral economics adds that layer of realism,
Okay.
recognizing that real people often deviate from those perfectly rational models.
So does that mean game theory is, like, fundamentally flawed?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's not about one approach being right or wrong.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the strengths and limitations of each.
Okay.
Game theory gives us this rigorous foundation
Yeah.
for understanding strategic thinking,
Okay.
and behavioral economics helps us explain why people sometimes do things that seem,
Irrational.
counterproductive.
Exactly. So it's about finding that balance, using game theory
As a starting point,
Okay.
and then adding those behavioral insights
Yeah.
to get a more complete picture.
And that's led to some pretty cool discoveries.
Oh, yeah.
Not just about human behavior,
Yeah.
but about, like, the biology of decision-making.
Exactly right. We're talking about neuroeconomics.
Neuroeconomics, yeah, I've heard the term, but I'm not really sure what it is.
It's this really cutting-edge field
Okay.
that looks at the brain processes behind economic decision-making.
Okay, so they're literally looking at the brain
Yeah, literally looking at the brain,
while people are making decisions.
using tool like fMRI.
So they're trying to, like, pinpoint what's happening in the brain
Yeah.
when we're assessing risk, calculating payoffs,
Exactly. All that strategic thinking,
all the mental work that goes into it.
all the mental work.
And they're finding, like, specific areas of the brain that are involved.
They are, yeah. It suggests that we might actually have a game theory module in our brains.
It's crazy to think we can, like, watch the brain playing games.
I know, it is wild, right?
Are there any experiments that, like, really stand out in this field?
Oh, absolutely. There's this one by Paul Glincher
Okay.
that involved monkeys playing this inspection game against a computer.
Okay, monkeys playing games.
Yeah.
All right, tell me more.
So the monkeys had to choose between, like, working for a reward
Okay.
or slacking off.
Classic.
Yeah, classic workplace dilemma, right?
Yeah.
But they knew that slacking off would only work if the computer wasn't watching them.
So they had to, like, guess
Yeah,
that they
exactly.
can get away with it.
And what's amazing is that the researchers could track the activity of individual neurons
Wow.
in the monkeys' brains as they played.
So they could see, like, what was happening at the neuron level.
And what they did was that the activity of these neurons
Yeah.
seemed to match up with the monkey's expected utility calculations.
So the neurons were acting like little economists.
Yeah, like little economists.
Thinking cost and benefit.
Exactly.
It's incredible.
It really is, but where does all this research lead?
Yeah. What's next for game theory?
Well, one area that's getting a lot of attention is evolutionary game theory.
Evolutionary game theory.
Yeah, it shifts the focus from individuals making choices
Okay.
to how strategies themselves evolve over time.
So it's like
Yeah.
Darwin meets game theory.
Exactly. Survival of the fittest strategies.
Okay. And how does that work?
Well, instead of looking at individual players,
Right.
evolutionary game theory looks at how successful strategies spread through a population,
Okay.
even if the individuals aren't consciously strategizing.
So it's not about intelligence, but about, like,
Yeah.
which strategies are most effective.
Exactly.
The ones that work, they stick around.
Yeah, they get replicated.
The ones that don't, they die out.
Exactly. And this approach has been really helpful
Okay.
for understanding all sorts of things, like
Yeah.
how altruism and cooperation evolved,
Wow.
the dynamics of animal communication,
Okay.
even the origins of language.
It's mind-blowing that game theory can tell us about such big questions.
I know, right? It really is amazing.
It makes me realize that we've just, like, scratched the surface.
Oh, absolutely.
There's so much more to explore.
Yeah, this is just the beginning.
Okay, well, for our philosopher friend listening,
Yeah,
I think this whole exploration of game theory
yeah,
offers a really cool new perspective
it does.
on some classic philosophical questions.
Absolutely. Questions like, how do our choices affect the common good?
Yeah.
How do social norms develop and change?
Right.
What are the limits of rationality in complex systems?
These are big questions.
Big question.
And game theory gives us a way to approach them.
Yeah, rigorous and insightful way.
It's like game theory bridges the gap
Yeah.
between abstract philosophical ideas
Right.
and how people actually behave.
Exactly. It lets us ground our philosophical thinking in the real world.
and test our ethical intuitions
Right.
against what actually happens.
Right, which can be unpredictable.
It can.
It definitely can.
Well, I think for anyone who wants to understand, like, what it means to be human,
Yeah.
philosopher, economist, biologist, whoever,
Anyone who's curious.
yeah, game theory is a really valuable tool.
It really is.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that we started with, like, soldiers on a battlefield,
I
and
know.
now we're talking about, like, the evolution of language, the
Right.
origins of cooperation.
Yeah, and what's so exciting is that game theory, it's not like a finished thing.
Right.
It's still developing, you know? Researchers are coming up with new models all the time.
New application.
New applications.
Yeah. So it's not so much about finding the one right answer.
Right.
It's more about, like, having this way of thinking.
Yeah, it gives us the tools to ask the right questions,
Yeah.
to challenge our assumptions.
Okay, and for you, our philosopher friend,
Yeah.
this exploration of game theory,
Yeah.
it offers a new way to think about some pretty classic philosophical questions.
Definitely. Like, how do individual choices impact the common good? How do social norms come about? How do they change?
Right.
What are the limits of rationality, especially in these, like, complicated social systems?
Yeah, these are big questions.
Big questions.
And game theory can help us tackle them.
In a way that makes sense, right?
Yeah, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's almost like a bridge,
Okay.
between these abstract philosophical ideas
Yeah.
and how people actually act in the real world.
It connects those two worlds.
It does, yeah. It lets us, like,
Yeah.
take our philosophical thinking
Mm-hmm.
and ground it in reality,
Right, and then test our ethical intuitions
Yeah.
against what actually happens.
which might be completely different.
Oh, yeah. Things don't always go as planned.
They don't.
That's for sure.
Well, I think for anyone who wants to understand,
Yeah.
what it means to be human,
Right, right.
philosopher, economist,
Biologist. Yeah, anyone who's curious.
game theory is a really valuable tool.
It is. It really is.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive,
We have.
from ancient battles to, like, the inner workings of the brain.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and it's clear to me that this field, it has so much more to offer.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just in terms of, like, specific answers, but in terms of, like, a whole new way of thinking.
Exactly. It's a new way of seeing the world.
And for our philosopher friend, I hope this exploration is giving
Yeah.
you some new ideas,
I hope so.
challenge some old assumptions, maybe even giving you a deeper appreciation for,
Yeah.
just how complex human behavior really is.
It's incredibly complex.
It is.
And all those strategic interactions that shape our lives.
I know. I've learned a lot,
Me too.
and I'm definitely walking away with more questions than answers.
That's always a good sign.
It is. It means we've had a successful deep dive.
It does.
So to our listener,
Yeah.
I encourage you to keep exploring this field.
Yeah, there's so much to discover.
You might be surprised by what you find.
Yeah.
Not just about the world, but about yourself.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.